certain tattoos have some relationship to gang affiliation, but a whole lot don't. And this is where sort of like urban youth counterculture and sort of heavy-handed policing really blur the lines of like who can be targeted for what and why. We have had deportation and we have had restrictive immigration in this country since the country exists, basically. This has always been a country that has both had a kind of welcoming of immigrants image coupled with a not these kind of immigrants asterisk. As much as Trump is terrorizing the immigrant community right now, he still has not reached Obama's numbers in terms of the numbers of people detained and deported.
Have you heard about MS-13? If you've been following the Trump administration's war on immigration, then you probably heard about accusations of gang affiliation, about asylum rules and denials, and about deportations. What is MS-13? What are asylum rights? What is the longer history of deportation, border control, and family separation? Where does the cruelty that we see today come from, and what is the future of immigration in the US? Today, I'm sitting with Amelia Frank-Vitale to talk about these questions. Amelia is an anthropologist at Princeton University. She works on immigration, focusing on Honduras and Honduran immigrants. She wrote this book, Leave If You Can: Migration and Violence in Bordered Worlds. The book discusses immigration, deportation, and gang violence. Take a listen.
So let's start at the beginning. You've been working on Honduras and Honduran immigrants for some years now. Obviously, every immigration or asylum story is different. But how different or similar are Honduran stories to those of neighboring countries such as Guatemala or Salvador?
Yeah, so there's a lot of differences. There are some things that are similar for sure. Honduras did not have sort of full-scale civil war in the 80s. Honduras did not have a full-armed Marxist insurgency like Nicaragua or El Salvador. Honduras did not have a decades-long brutal civil war of genocide like in Guatemala. There were those factors which really shaped migration from El Salvador and Guatemala in particular were not really at play in Honduras in the same way. Now, Honduras was the staging ground for U.S. counterinsurgency in the region, continues to have one of the largest U.S. military bases in the hemisphere. But in the 80s, it was really the home for what the U.S. Wanted to do in the rest of Central America. So much so that in Washington, they would call Honduras the USS Honduras, as though it was an aircraft carrier for the U.S. military. This shaped migration dynamics in particular in a really different way. So there weren't the same numbers of people from Honduras who left in the 80s and 90s. There was some migration. There are historical migration patterns, especially along the northern coast, around the banana trade, but it didn't really take off until after a really devastating hurricane in 1998, Hurricane Mitch, that just destroyed the country, destroyed social infrastructure, destroyed actual infrastructure. The country still hasn't really rebuilt from Mitch. And there was really then the beginnings of migration, mass migration out of Honduras happens after Hurricane Mitch. So fast forward a couple of decades, that shapes dynamics through to the current day in terms of the numbers of people who were eligible for some kind of adjustment of status after the amnesty that happened in the mid-1980s, far fewer Hondurans. There are some Hondurans who have TPS. TPS was granted for Hondurans after Hurricane Mitch, but it's a smaller number of people compared to like the Salvadoran population who has TPS in the United States. All this is to say that like there was a smaller pool of people with status, but also a smaller pool of people who were being deported back to Honduras when changes to the law in the mid-1990s rendered a lot of people who already had status deportable. Including many people who ended up being part of the formation of gangs in El Salvador. There was some of that in Honduras, but it was a smaller phenomenon. It was a smaller factor in the trajectory that would happen in Honduras in the 2000s than in neighboring El Salvador. There's a lot of other details I could get into, but that's sort of a general overview.
These are really important details, and we're going to dive deeper into some of them. I think Hurricane Mitch, I mean, at the time I emigrated from Egypt in 2008. And so I was at the time in Hurricane Mitch. What year was Hurricane Mitch again?
1998.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I was in medical school in Egypt at the time. And I remember even there, we were, the media all over the world was talking about this devastating hurricane and its effect on people everywhere. I think this was, for me at least, this was the first big hurricane to hear about, or at least something of that size.
Yeah. Yeah, it really was a devastating and sort of unprecedented levels at the time. And Honduras was very unprepared and very unequipped to deal with the fallout of the hurricane.
So before we go back to environmental conditions and environmental disasters, I think for many of us, the current discourse that the Trump administration has been pushing for, since Trump took office, but also really during the elections, have always been about gangs and the idea that, creating this kind of boogeyman of what gangs are and how deportation policy needs to be essentially centered around the idea of gangs. And of course, the most famous of these is MS-13. You do work on MS-13 and on other gangs. So tell us a little bit about this. What is MS-13?
Sure. MS-13 is the Mara Salvatrucha 13. It is, so there's a long history of MS-13. Other people have written about that in particular, I think better than I could. But the sort of short version of the story is MS-13 is really a gang that emerges out of Los Angeles. And it's sort of rival gang, which in Honduras is known as Barrio 18. In LA, it was the 18th Street Gang. And both of these gangs exist prior to this, but really become the space for the home for the Salvadoran diaspora in Los Angeles. So youth who were fleeing war in Central America, in El Salvador in particular, find themselves in Los Angeles in the 1980s that was complicated on many levels, racially segregated, and gangs formed a big part of, especially in sort of the poorer parts of the city, how young people navigated life. And the Salvadorans were found themselves sort of folded into a landscape of gang culture, of Los Angeles, of U.S. gang culture in a particular way. And the Mara Salvatrucha really becomes the sort of vehicle for this and the identity location for this in LA among young Salvadoran men. And that's the same with Barrio 18, although the Mara Salvatrucha, I think, has MS-13 has like an oversized sort of place in the U.S. imaginary, right? But both of these gangs are essentially deported back to Central America. They're not they don't emerge in the context of Central America on their own. They come out of Los Angeles. And when the United States makes some very punitive changes to its immigration and deportation laws in the mid-1990s, a lot of people who had legal status, whether a green card or TPS or some other or some other the status adjustment that had happened after the laws changed, found themselves newly deportable. So in the mid-1990s, one of the things that this law changed was that people who had been convicted of certain kinds of crimes, they get called an aggravated felony, in immigration law, but that's actually a term of art. It's not actually a legal category. So they can be other crimes that in aggregate get thought of as a felony in the context of immigration, but are not actually felonies in criminal law. All this is to say that people who had convictions, even if they had already gone to prison, if they had pled out, whatever the case may be, the law was applied retroactively. So a lot of people who had had gang involvement in their youth, for example, and maybe were no longer involved, but also people who were actively involved, and I don't want to overly romanticize that dynamic, found themselves eligible for deportation, including legal permanent residents. And so a bunch of people were deported to El Salvador in particular, and this happened in Honduras, but to a smaller degree, who did not have much familiarity with life in El Salvador. But they did have familiarity with gang culture, which includes sort of the control of territory, the defense of neighborhoods, and the kind of protection that coming together and the use of violence, for sure, allows young, kind of unintegrated young men. And so the gang culture that people had from Los Angeles, they bring with them to Central America, and it mutates there. I mean, the dynamics on the ground in El Salvador in the mid-90s are very, very different. El Salvador has just recently signed peace accords to put an end to a very brutal civil war. And that is a tenuous peace. And people who have been deported are looked at as likely criminals and as probably it's their fault and something is wrong with them. And so they also find themselves sort of unable to get a foothold in an El Salvador that they don't really know very well, that is just emerging from decades of violence. And so the gangs sort of reform, but in their own way. They reform from building from the sort of blueprint from Los Angeles, but they also then, over the decades since then, evolve in ways that are very particular to Central America. In Honduras, and I'll end this answer with this part. In Honduras, there's a little bit of a different dynamic, or it's the dynamic that I know best anyway. It's been very well documented what happened in El Salvador. And I can suggest further reading for that if viewers are interested. Juan and Oscar Martinez, for example, they have a book called The Hollywood Kid that really narrates that story in great detail. Also, Alana Zilberg's Spaces of Detention is really important in narrating that original process in the case of El Salvador. In Honduras, it's a little bit different. The story, there are fewer sort of OG gang members from Los Angeles who are deported back to Honduras, although there are some of that. There's also kind of a process in Honduras of small local, like, street gangs who were sort of fighting with each other over, like, girls and, who gets to go to the dance in the town hall. It sounds too quaint, but it is the story that people have talked about over and over again. And that slowly evolves into a whole suite of street gangs in Honduras, including MS-13, and in Honduras, what is known as Barrio 18, but also other gangs. The sort of landscape of gangs in Honduras is more heterogeneous than those two gangs, more heterogeneous than what ends up happening in El Salvador, and also kind of particular to Honduras. So although the gangs share the names with gangs in El Salvador and Guatemala, in the United States, and elsewhere, they're really kind of operating in their own way and develop their own sort of rules and procedures within the context of Honduras.
This is a really interesting story, particularly this idea of how problems of, in many cases, marginalization and racial segregation in the U.S. gets to be exported and then reorganized in particular ways in Central America, and then become essentially the kind of, the language the Trump administration is using to discuss the problems with all of these issues and the problems of immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a sort of U.S. exported phenomena, for sure.
So in your book, you describe also how gangs affect the geography of the city, how how they affect how people move, learn, live, and work. And you have a number of really fascinating and also heartbreaking stories about how these gangs and gang violence affect people. Can you tell us? Can you tell us a little bit more about this? How do gangs affect people's lives?
Yeah. So on the first part of that answer is I just want to really stress, and I think I do this a lot in the book, just how much gangs are part of the communities where they operate, where they exist. In the neighborhoods in Honduras where I was working, like the gang members, the people who are controlling the lives of their fellow residents, like grew up alongside the other kids in the neighborhood. They all went to elementary school together. Their mothers know the other mothers in the neighborhood. And when they target someone for violence, they know those people very well. Sometimes gang members do get moved around to different neighborhoods, like that does happen, but they are so much of the neighborhood. They're not a kind of external force that comes in and takes over. Although there are processes of different gangs fighting over territory, but the sort of rank and file, the people who keep gang control going on the daily are from the neighborhoods that they control. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is there's a lot of different ways in which gangs exercise their control and sort of act out the ways that they govern the neighborhoods that they control. And one of those is control on mobility. And so in Honduras, the gangs are very, very concerned with a sort of internally looking surveillance of what their residents are doing and who is coming in and out of each neighborhood. And when I'm talking about neighborhoods, I'm talking about maybe 8 square blocks of single-story concrete homes and mostly dirt streets, like unpaved roads. This is in San Pedro Sula. This is the country's industrial capital and economic capital. But there is such a long history of kind of disinvestment of any kind of infrastructural project. So we're talking about concrete homes, concrete block homes, mostly that people have built themselves on land that they may or may not technically own, but in many cases have been there for generations, and dirt streets. And there's no necessarily marking of when you have crossed from one neighborhood into another neighborhood. These are not necessarily, there's not necessarily signs that say like you are now entering Cerrito Lindo, El Quitur, but people know the geography. People know very, very well the geography because as you cross from one neighborhood into the other, if you are crossing into the territory controlled by a different gang, and we're talking about it in one sector of the city, in one sort of district of the city called Rivera Hernandez, there's at any time between 6 and 8 different gangs that control 160 some different neighborhoods, or I'm sorry, 60 some different neighborhoods. And so that landscape is really fraught. Moving from one neighborhood to the next could mean crossing into the territory of a whole host of different gangs, right? We're not talking about just 2 different groups here. And so people know this geography because one of the clearest ways to get yourself on the radar of the gangs as someone who is disloyal, as someone who is suspicious, is by letting them know or letting them think that you have relationships, you have communication with people in a neighborhood controlled by a rival gang. The gangs are kind of hyper focused on, because they think of themselves as being at war, at sort of constant war with the other gangs, are hyper focused on who might be connected to a rival neighborhood, who might be potentially connected to the rival gangs. And so having a kind of constant vigilance over who enters and exits their neighborhoods, where their residents are going, and who is coming in is a huge priority. So often in gang-controlled neighborhoods in Honduras, when you cross into the neighborhood, which unless you know what you're doing, you might not know that you have done so, There is often a young guy, maybe a child, maybe a sort of preteen, hanging out on the corner of these dirt streets with a cell phone in hand, sending text messages, making phone calls, watching, but watching who is coming in and who is coming out. And those people get reported back. And if there's any suspicion, they get stopped. And if they get stopped and are discovered to belong to a rival neighborhood, they're most likely killed. This is especially true for young men. Those are the people whose mobility is especially suspicious and is especially surveilled. So the sort of borders of neighborhoods, and this is why the book is called Bordered Worlds, because the borders of neighborhoods become the first sort of education that young people in the urban margins of Honduras have in terms of how just by moving across a piece of land, their life could be put at risk and they could be subjected to violence.
And we started talking about this a little bit. You also talk about in the book about the economic and political context that facilitates this and that leads to this. And you describe it as both as a unique context that is particular to Honduras, but also as something that is an example of other Central American countries. So can you help us understand this a little bit more, the economic and political context that led to this situation?
So I often try to talk about the specificity of Honduras because from the U.S. perspective, often Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador get talked about as the Northern Triangle. Right. And that is a sort of securitized gaze, thinking about Central America from a U.S., from the perspective of U.S. interests and sort of thinking about that region as a singular place that presents a particular kind of problem for the United States. And the dynamics in each country are really quite different. That said, there are some similarities, especially in terms of the relationship between what has happened historically in Central America and the United States. So I mentioned earlier the counterinsurgency in the 1980s into the 1990s, the U.S. really concerned about the Nicaraguan revolution spilling over. This is the domino effect idea that the revolution in 79 in Nicaragua is going to lead to the dominoes falling of supposedly democratic countries in the rest of Central America, and eventually making its way to the United States, right? That was the Reagan era sort of theory of the case. And so the intervention across Central America was militaristic, very, very repressive. And the United States was deeply involved in the dirty wars across Central America, including in Honduras. So even though Honduras did not have the same scale of armed insurrection or civil war, there were hundreds of people disappeared by an army battalion that was trained by the United States. Like those same dynamics to a lesser degree did happen in Honduras. But I think the sort of the other piece of this, and so I talked about earlier that how gangs were sort of exported from the United States, but so was the kind of iron-fisted policing strategies of the 1990s in the United States. The sort of the kinds of things that we saw from Rudy Giuliani in New York City, but elsewhere in the United States, that also gets exported to Central America. And in Central America, it gets called mano dura, which means like hard hand, but it's sort of the intellectual equivalent of iron-fisted policing strategies, and that really starts in Honduras in the early 2000s. It also is what is taken up in El Salvador and in Guatemala and becomes the sort of standard approach to what they see as a growing gang problem. Now, those policies, especially in the case of Honduras, which is obviously the case I know the best, really contribute to the process of turning sort of like unruly street gangs who were like fighting over which girls to dance with into much more organized, much more sophisticated, much more hierarchical organizations that we see more today. So in part, there's a lot of different reasons for this. And there's a lot of parallels to this, to the policing strategies that have emerged out of the United States, because that's really where they come from in the case of Central America. Young people and like urban youth culture starts to be criminalized. So people can become targeted because of how they dress. Sound familiar? Because of who they're hanging out with. Just by existing in a space that is thought to be part of gangland territory, young people are seen with suspicion. And in this way, sort of the suspicion that I talked about on behalf of gangs is really also reflective of the suspicion that police have of all young men who exist, who just live their lives in the neighborhoods that are thought to be affiliated with one gang or another. This is especially true where the crime of what is called in Honduras asociación ilícita, illicit association, gets put into law. So even if you have not participated in any actual criminal activity, you could be charged with illicit association because the police believe you to be associated with people who they identify as gang members. And one of the things that is very evident to me in Honduras is that to survive in neighborhoods controlled by gangs, you have to be associated with gang members. That doesn't mean you like it. That doesn't mean you have ever picked up a weapon of any kind, but you have to maintain good relationships with the people who essentially govern your neighborhood, who govern in a way that is full of the threat of violence. But no one in a neighborhood controlled by a gang can be unassociated with the gang. So a lot of people get incarcerated. A lot of people get charged. The gangs themselves, which were kind of unruly and a little bit ad hoc, start to organize in prison. It's sort of the sort of classic story of the way in which incarceration actually contributes to more violent organizations, better organized organizations, and more corrupt organizations, because they have a sort of clearer relationship to the security forces in Honduras. This is another piece of the sort of context overall in Honduras, which is a suite of security forces that have a long history of being among the most corrupt in the hemisphere. And Latin America is a place known for complicated policing relationships, to say the least. But the Honduran police have, in particular, been really deeply imbricated with all sorts of corruption, from petty to really sophisticated, over the last couple decades. And the one last thing I want to say about the specificity of Honduras is Honduras also becomes the midway point for drug trafficking from mostly Colombia and Venezuela to Mexico. And this is important because one of the things that happens in the sort of discourse around gangs in the United States is that all kinds of organized crime get collapsed into the same thing, and they're not. So there are gangs in Honduras, MS-13, Barrio 18, and a bunch of other ones, and there are narco groups, which are not the same thing. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they fight with each other, sometimes they contract with each other, but they are very different organizations in terms of their goals, their relationship to the communities that they exist in. And Honduras, unlike the rest of Central America, Honduras is the midway point. A couple years ago, the statistic was 90% of the cocaine consumed in the United States traveled through Honduras. So the presence of the money and the power that money confers in Honduras is really particular in a way that isn't quite the same in El Salvador, is differently organized in Guatemala. The drugs also have to go through Guatemala to get to Honduras, to get to Mexico, excuse me. But Honduras, since the mid 80s, also becomes the sort of hub, the middleman for the entire cocaine trade in the region, which adds another element to the political economy of all of this, because the politics, the sort of this has come out in recent years in very, very clear ways, but political power also becomes deeply, deeply connected to the drug trade in Honduras.
This is a really important context, and I think the point of collapsing different categories is really important, because in a way, it is a step towards dehumanization and understanding all of these problems as just one single problem, and for which there is a single solution, which is more policing and militarization. And also, it's the point that you make about crimes of association is really, really interesting, because your remark on this, how it is really part of the U.S. police culture, but also how the Trump administration is using exactly the same argument for deportations right now. So you have a tattoo, and then suddenly now you're associated and you're immediately considered to be criminal.
Yeah. Yeah, the gang databases, right? The idea that there is a group of tattoos that law enforcement knows mean a certain thing, and that is shared internationally. That is not just with it circulating within the U.S. context, but in Honduras, tattoos are very socially stigmatized. Certainly, certain tattoos have some relationship to gang affiliation, but a whole lot don't. And this is where sort of like urban youth counterculture and sort of heavy-handed policing really blur the lines of like who can be targeted for what and why. And in Honduras, people can be sent to what's called prisión preventiva, like pretrial detention, for up to 2 years while the police investigate. And that's in the same prisons as the heads of Barrio 18, or like the people who have been convicted of crimes in very overcrowded prisons where there are frequently mass violent events. Like the sort of funneling young people into criminal connection is really a feature of how policing and incarceration work in Honduras as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's, after all, these are people who are not convicted of crimes. I mean, even if you have a tattoo that actually belongs to a gang, that's not in itself a crime. And so policing becomes almost its own judiciary, its own way of creating and punishing crimes, convicting and punishing at the same time.
Completely. And in Honduras, the police have a pretty well-known preference for MS-13. I really recommend the work of Juan Martinez de Huizon. He's a Salvadoran anthropologist and journalist who's done a lot of work specifically on the evolution of MS-13 in Honduras. Also, John Horn Carter, specifically on the gangs in the Tegucigalpa area and in the capital area in the wake of Hurricane Mitch. Both excellent sources to get more into the sort of history of gang evolution. But I talk about one young man in my book who is a gang member. He's not pretending he's not a gang member. I meet him as a gang member. That is his identity. But he was kind of a low-level gang member, and he gets arrested for stealing cars. And he like can't help but laugh because he tells it to me and he says, I mean, they could have gotten me for so many things, but stealing cars, I don't even know how to drive, which I think just encapsulates sort of the figure of who ends up being pulled into gangs in Honduras. But because of that, he gets put into prison, into the sort of maximum security prison in Honduras. And he's there for 2 years. And eventually he's released because there is no case. That the police regularly arrest people based on nothing. And this was certainly a case of that, since the kid doesn't know how to drive a car. And when he gets out of prison, he is now he has more points. He has more stature in his gang. He's 22 years old. He's been in jail for 2 years with the highest ranking people in Barrio 18. And so he gets more responsibility. He's given more responsibility. He's asked to take over the sort of control of the neighborhood where he has lived. And he's like in this one young man's story, all of that is encapsulated. Going to prison makes him more of a violent actor. Going to prison for something that he did not do, that was unrelated to anything else, only cements his position in that gang. And he talks about being targeted by police when they come through the neighborhood, not like with an arrest warrant, not because he has done a particular thing that they're looking for him, but what they do is they pick him up, they put him in the back of their pickup truck, and they drop him off in the territory of a rival gang, counting on the rival gang to kill him. He escapes, he's able to tell the story, but like that is extrajudicial violence, right? That is so far outside the realm of anything like due process, that it serves to, and he is a gang member, so he kind of expects to have a short life. He expects the relationship with the police to be antagonistic. But other young men in that same neighborhood who are not gang members, who dress a lot like this same kid, right? Who live next door to him, who grew up alongside him, also get picked up by the police and dumped in a neighborhood by the rival gang, as a way of kind of social cleansing. And so it creates a situation where the population, the folks who live in these neighborhoods, like really are terrified of the police, really don't trust the police, and think of themselves and think of the police as being at war, like with them, not with the criminal organization, but with their children, with their sons.
Let's shift back to immigration and deportation. And deportation obviously spiked under the current Trump administration, but it has a long history as an integral part of U.S. immigration policy. How did the deportation regime, if you will, change over time? What is the recent history of the deportation regime that we see it today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the immigration landscape as we know it, the detention and deportation and border buildup, really takes shape in one way in the mid 1990s, sort of coinciding with the passage of NAFTA. There is an understanding that NAFTA is going to wreak havoc on the Mexican economy in particular sectors, including the rural sector. And that is going to produce more migration to the United States, and that in order to deter that migration, the United States adopts a policy border-wide called prevention through deterrence. The idea being that by sort of shutting off the most populous parts of the border to crossing, so El Paso and Tijuana and other places, but like those two sectors in particular, by really building up resources there, they're going to funnel undocumented migration through the parts of the borderlands that are more remote, inhospitable, and very, very dangerous, like Arizona, like the Arizona sector of the border. The idea being that because it is going to be more dangerous, more people are going to suffer, and that will serve as a deterrent. So fewer people will come. The first part of that equation absolutely happened. Deaths in the Arizona desert start to spike, and have continued to be very high since the mid 1990s. The second part never works. The deterrence part never works. The other sort of major turning point in terms of detention and deportation happens after 9/11. The sort of reorganization of everything into the Department of Homeland Security, including all the immigration enforcement and adjudication, and a sort of like renewed focus on having to get rid of people, having to not sort of suspicion of the people who are in the country. Really shapes, I think, what happens over the next 20 years. So we have had deportation and we have had restrictive immigration in this country since the country exists, basically. This has always been a country that has both had a kind of welcoming of immigrants image coupled with a not these kind of immigrants asterisk, right? That goes back to the beginnings of the United States and the settler colonialism that exists here, is one of a particular kind of immigrant is valorized and a particular kind of immigrant is criminalized, often in juxtaposition to another. So to some extent, what's happening now is it's not out of character for the United States. This is very much a part of what this country has been like for a very long time. But there have been ebbs and flows. There have been peaks, not surprisingly, when the labor market is tighter. There is sort of a renewed outcry about the presence of immigrants taking jobs, when there is a need for more more able-bodied workers, all of a sudden the immigration gets a little bit more lax. So we can sort of chart this over time. Adam Goodman has a great book called the Deportation Machine that kind of looks historically as how this has changed over time. The moment we're in right now is really the product of a couple of things, including the failed immigration reform of the early 2000s. There was the possibility, the sort of on the horizon of immigration reform that never really happened during the George W. Bush administration. Obama, I think Obama thought that he knew what the point of compromise was going to be. And so he kind of offered the enforcement first part as a way to get Congress to do the regularization part, but that never happened, and he only did the enforcement part. So the sort of Obama gets called the deporter in chief because as much as Trump is terrorizing the immigrant community right now, he still has not reached Obama's numbers in terms of the numbers of people detained and deported. One of the things that I think has shifted that maybe gets lost a little bit in the narrative right now is that there are times in the country where the focus is really on recent arrivals, that there's really a focus on the U.S.-Mexico border of detaining people who are crossing and deporting people who are crossing. So both Obama and Biden had some particular mechanisms of sort of expediting and other administrations as well, of sort of expediting the processing of people who are recent arrivals. In the Obama administration, that there was also sort of the exercise of discretion, trying to think about families and people who had been here a long time as not being the priority for enforcement, but newer arrived people being the priority. One of the things that the Trump administration is doing now makes it more visible, I think, is just how much they are focusing on interior enforcement. So sending ICE into U.S. cities in the north, sending Border Patrol from the border into U.S. cities in that far from the border, kind of brings the kind of terror that has existed along the border for a long time into other parts of the country that didn't really have to grapple with it previously. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing now is more openly cruel, right? They are sort of delighting in the cruelty of this and the violence of it. They want the spectacle. They're not shying away from it. But it is sort of an extension and an extreme of things that have certainly been part of the sort of U.S. immigration and deportation architecture going back quite a long time. One of the things that I think, one of the things that my book really talks about is the time when, rather than focusing on people who've made it to the United States, and rather than focusing on people who've been living in the United States for a long time, during the Obama administration, not exclusively, but certainly during the Obama administration, one of the things that happens is the real move to get Mexico to detain and deport people before they ever make it to the United States. And that's really the moment when the dynamics that are chronicled in the book come into being, where there's a steady process of border externalization, of pushing detention and deportation, decoupling it from the actual international border. So funding Mexico, supporting Mexico, equipment to Mexico, training to Mexico, but also really pressuring Mexico to build up its own enforcement and interdiction architecture so that people are stopped before they ever make it to the United States. There's a long process of this. It builds over time, but it really becomes intensified after 2014, when there is the arrival of unaccompanied minors. That becomes sort of a moment of a spotlight on Central American migration during the Obama administration. And one of their responses to this is to really push Mexico to develop a better program of stopping people before they make it to the U.S.-Mexico border so that we don't have to deal with it. So it doesn't look like ICE agents, arresting people in New York City immigration court. It doesn't look like ICE agents shooting people in their cars in Minneapolis. But it is still, that violence is still happening. It's just happening kind of beyond the frame of what I think everyday people in the United States are aware of. But as of 2015, Mexico detained and deported more Central Americans year over year than the United States did. Until the pandemic and CBP1 and dynamics sort of get all changed then. But it's really one of the sort of features of our deportation regime over the last decade or so has been to outsource it, to actually get other countries to do the work of detaining and deporting people for us so that they don't actually make it to the United States. They can't activate the rights of seeking asylum if they don't actually set foot on the United States, on United States soil. And I don't think there's the political fallout from there's not the attention that the spectacle of violent detention produces.
At the end of every episode, we ask about vital signs, which is the name of the podcast. And we think about vital signs in two different ways. One, things that we need to pay attention to or keep an eye on to just know whether things are improving or deteriorating. The signs that show us the state of health, if you will, on these questions. So what are the vital signs that we should pay attention to when it comes to questions of immigration, asylum, deportation, etc.?
Oh, it's such a hard moment, right? The things are so dark. I think that the fact that people are still trying to migrate despite all of this, despite this situation, despite this government, despite its rhetoric, despite its policies, is really a testament to kind of like the human spirit to not necessarily, it's not necessarily like hopeful. It's not necessarily like people believe that things are going to be great, but like people are determined to make the life for themselves that they think is going to be the best of all possibilities. And I think we see over and over again just how much deportation doesn't work. It doesn't do what it sets out to do. It doesn't make people not move. It doesn't. Some people, some individuals, sure, but just the other day I saw people in Honduras are convoking are getting together a new caravan. Like people are still going to try and figure out how to make life, how to make the world one that is most livable. And I think that's going to outlast Trump. That's going to outlast Stephen Miller. And I think the kinds of reactions that we're seeing from communities in the United States is also really encouraging in that respect. Like the community support in Minneapolis got them to stand down. It really did. Right now, I'm in New Jersey. I'm speaking to you from New Jersey. At Delaney Hall, a detention center in northern New Jersey, there has been a hunger strike among the people detained there for a few days now. And there's been community support on the outside that this whole time, just round the clock community support. And that all of that, right? Like all of this is going to outlast. All of this is going to endure. This is a really scary moment for a lot of people, and people's lives are being fundamentally upended. People are being subjected to violence, and people are dying because of these policies. Like I don't want to sugarcoat that, but I also think that in the wake of this kind of destruction, eventually there will be opportunity for rebuilding, and maybe for building new things. The system that we had was pretty bad. This is worse. But I do think that there is possibly going to be an opening to something that is better and more humane in the wake of this. At least that's what I keep hoping.
That's really important. And the other way we think about vital signs is essentially almost like road signs, direction to move, important signs that we think about and which direction we should go. So, what are some of these directions that you think a humane and a progressive policy in relation to immigration can take? What are the directions we should be thinking about?
So, I mean, there's some really basic stuff like USCIS needs to be funded. USCIS, we have so gone before the Trump administration, but certainly right now, so gone in the direction of funding enforcement, but not funding the sort of bureaucracy of immigration. Like all the people who are applying for green cards and H-1B visas and adjustment of status and just the like really kind of the mundane immigration things, which this government is also attacking. I guess that's another thing I should have added that is different now. The sort of move to illegalize people, to remove status from people who have it, is to make more people undocumented is a new feature right now. But really robustly funding USCIS, which if I understand it correctly, like is sort of self-funded by the fees that they charge. So allocating more funds into the facilitation of immigration rather than the enforcement of it is one thing that I think would be kind of easy to do and would make a lot of sense. One thing I've said for a long time is that we need to really there's a lot that's very complex about our immigration system. And, people have talked about comprehensive immigration reform for decades. That is needed. We have a system that is really reflective of the 1990s and does not really respond to the world as it is. I think some really basic things that would be useful that are not sort of my ideal immigration system, but that could just happen, would be to really expand access to work visas that were not tied to an employer. So thinking about Central America, really specifically, thinking about like the people I talked about who can't get through the planting season, right? Like can't feed themselves through the planting season. If there were a kind of visa that allowed people to come directly, work for 6 months and go back and get it again the next year, right? That there was a sense that like they would be able to return. There are a lot of people in Central America for whom that would be life-changing, life-altering. They would not try and seek asylum. They would not try and stay here. A lot of people don't want to live here. They actually want to live in their communities, but they need to be able to do so in a way that is dignified and that allows them to build lives for themselves and their families. I also think right now we see a real restriction on asylum. I think we need to expand what we think about when we think about protection. The asylum statutes that we have were built in the wake of the Second World War and in the throes of the Cold War. So really thinking about political persecution in a very particular and narrow sense. And a lot of the kinds of violences that really do put people's lives at risk in many parts of the world today, including Central America, don't fit into those statutes. So I've done a lot of expert testimony in Honduran asylum cases, and people whose lives are absolutely threatened sometimes are unable to win an asylum case because the kind of person doing the threatening isn't the kind of person that the asylum statutes contemplate. There's been a lot of reasons why that has endured over the time, including concerns about flooding and too many people. All of those concerns haven't really worked to deter. But I think we really need to update what we think about internationally when we think about persecution. And then one other thing I'll say is like we have invested so much into border security and to policing and to militarization, both at our border and into Latin America, and in terms of policing in Central America. I think if I could design policy, like investing all of that into social infrastructure would really change things. I try to really stay away from the language of migration as a crisis because I think migration is the most human thing in the history of humanity, to move when life gets difficult. That's what we do. But there are other crises that contribute to migration. The crises of people dying trying to migrate is a policy-made one. That is something that our policies have produced. And there are kinds of interventions in Central America or in the United States that could make it less crisis-full for people who are trying to migrate. I think a lot of the interventions, I mean, right now we're in a landscape where the U.S. has slashed off funding of all sorts of things. So this is perhaps in the mode of rebuilding, if that is a possibility in the future. But so many of the interventions that the U.S. has historically made have been short-term, have been short-sighted, have been deeply infused with the sort of principles of the prosperity gospel. And And I think in a place like Honduras, like we need to be thinking about what kinds of interventions would support generational change, not change that's going to be evident in 6 months or a year, but that in 30 years, there is actually a different outlook for people. I think education, I think really universal and fully funded and wonderful education would potentially change the outlook for some people. I'm not saying that's going to stop migration. I don't think we need to stop migration, but would give people options. That young man who was a member of a gang who I mentioned earlier, he said to me he wished he could have stayed in school. Like he would have liked to have had a different life, but he did not feel that a different life was an option for him in Honduras in his youth. And doing the things that would make options available is really the only thing that is going to make people less interested in migrating when all the other things around them break.
Amelia, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today. This was absolutely fantastic.
Can I add one more thing?
Please, go ahead.
You know, when I was writing the book, I thought that I was writing a book about just how much gangs replicate the logics of states in sort of their bordering and their surveillance and the obsession they have with movement. And as I am talking about the book, since it has been published, I think, and in this moment of such anti-immigrant sentiment, I think we need to turn that a little bit on its head, because I think when I talk to people about young, like 15-year-olds killing each other over a couple of dirt streets, people readily see how absurd that is. Like, I think there is a reaction to that that recognizes the absurdity of murdering people for crossing over a street. And I think maybe if we can hold on to that, maybe then we can also see the absurdity of that same violence when it is wielded by nation states against people who have crossed over a line that we have drawn on the land.
This is very well put. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not only that gangs function as states, but in these cases, states function as gangs.
Yeah, it's the same obsession with mobility, the same obsession with who is supposed to be on this side of our territory and who is not, and that violence, that it is understandable and something that people should expect to suffer violence if they cross those lines. It's the same logic.
Thank you so much, Amelia.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you learned as much as I did. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and make sure to join our Patreon for exclusive content that you don't want to miss. The conversation continues on the Vital Signs Substack, Instagram, and Facebook page. Let us know your thoughts in the comments and any impact this conversation may have on your thinking. See you next time.